and the early 90s, most of Latin America was ruled by neoliberal governments that, of course, the US approved of. And the social movements, the trade union movements, they'd been absolutely battered by the debt crisis. They were very weak. And basically the powers that be in the United States didn't think there was very much to worry about. And then slowly you began to see moments of protest. In 1994 you saw the Zapatistas suddenly emerge and protest against the North American Free Trade Agreement. You saw protests against privatization in Bolivia. You saw the landless movement in Brazil. So bit by bit there was this sort of crescendo of protest in Latin America, but still the United States was concentrating on Iraq, Afghanistan, and wasn't really taking notice of the groundswell of opposition to neoliberalism in Latin America. And then you started getting left-wing governments being elected, but slowly, first you had Chile, an actual socialist rather than a Christian Democrat, Venezuela, then you've got Brazil, Lula, a factory worker being elected, and suddenly, without the US really taking notice, almost the whole continent was governed by left-wing presidents. And then they really began to have to take notice, because those left-wing governments, particularly those in the so-called ALBA, Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Correa in Ecuador, Ortega in Nicaragua, really decided to sort of set themselves up as an alternative power and set up an alternative alliance in opposition to the US idea of the free trade agreement of the Americas, which the left in Latin America said would only benefit large corporations. The United States, which for more than a century has been the most important economic power in Latin America, it still is, but its influence has declined economically, so it only accounts for, say, a third of foreign investment in Latin America now. So for most countries, certainly in South America, economically they're much more diversified. They send exports to Europe and to Asia and so on. And in international fora, Brazil particularly, in alliance with Russia and China and India, they're playing, they're playing a much more important role on the world stage, and sometimes the third world countries are forming an alliance to stand up to the United States and Europe. So geopolitically, the world has changed, and also I think the global economic crisis has really shown that neoliberalism doesn't work. It's been a disaster in the United States. And in Europe, it's caused a terrible recession. But where the clearest failure of neoliberalism was actually shown in Latin America first, where it actually led to an increase in poverty. I mean, in some countries, the change was incredible. In Argentina, which used to be thought of as a first world country in Latin America, suddenly 40% of the population were living and working in the informal sector. Pensioners couldn't get their monies out of the banks. They were pounding on the doors of the banks to try and get their money, their savings. And the point about this is that Argentina had actually followed the IMF prescriptions. They'd done everything that had been told of them, and it was an absolute disaster. Certain Latin American countries like Brazil is playing a much more important role on the world stage with other emerging economies like India and Russia and China. They're forming an alliance, and they're sort of standing up to the rich countries, the US and Europe, and putting the voice of the third world on the international stage. So Latin America is certainly not a walkover for the US anymore. They have to take into account, they have to listen to what Latin American governments are saying now.